Right. So really pleased to have you join us this afternoon, evening, whatever it is, especially on a very sunny Sunday in October. Um, we have a fairly short amount of time together, just an hour or so, to deal with a really, really big topic. Um, and I think the main thing that I want to get across is that it is a big topic. The question of LGBT history in Judaism is not something that's small or insignificant or only referenced in fringe sources. In fact, the title that I put for this evening's was A Rainbow Thread, and that was a direct steal from an excellent book called A Rainbow Thread, which is, as you can see, quite hefty and entirely full of primary sources about queer and LGBT identities in Jewish history, from ancient to modern times, meaning translations of poetry, translations of religious responsa, translations of halachic works, all notated and annotated by the very able Noam Sienna, who is an absolutely amazing human being and scholar, and with a great foreword by Judith Plasko. So just an incredible resource for understanding LGBT primary sources in Jewish tradition. Huge and fascinating range of stuff. Everything that we're going to take a look at tonight is in this book. There's a lot more though that isn't. That's the first thing to say, is that this is really just a sampling of a much larger body of work. The other thing to say is that I myself am not someone who's a member of the queer community, but am an ally. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different point of view. And some of the sources that we're going to look at, due to their age or to their bias, are not sources that we might agree with. They're not many sources I agree with. But what I want us to get a look at is how the view of uh, LGBT identity practices, understandings, lifestyles, etc., has developed and has changed and has grown, and also how it's always been a part of Jewish identity in some way or another. We have to infer that sometimes from secondary sources, but it's obvious once we dig into it that there's always been such things there. So what, as always, I want to take a look at sources predominantly rather than conjectures. And as a result, I've got a source sheet I'm going to share with us so that we can take a look at it. And everything's in English, so maybe we can take turns reading and I'll provide some context. And we'd like it if we had the chance to do some discussions as well, especially because once again, I am an ally, but not myself someone who necessarily is part of this rainbow thread of history that Noam describes. So I'm going to share my screen with us. And the first, can everyone see that? Adobe being funny. Okay. The first source here is actually not a Jewish source. It's from the Roman poet Martial. Um, maybe it's pronounced Martial, I don't know. Not a Latinist. And it's interesting because it was a mean letter he wrote to someone else. But what we learned from it is something about the Jewish community in Rome in the first century, by virtue of his insults towards the person he's writing to. So a flame war, so to speak, a grudge match between poets actually turns into an interesting source for us to take a look at. So anyone feel brave enough to read this first source for us? Zachary, I might call on you just because I can see you laughing. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. It's my fault for reading ahead. That you are too jealous of me and always denigrate my little poetry books. I can forgive. You're smart enough for a Kerkok poet. Nor do I even care that you pick through my poems and steal them. As I said, you're smart enough for a Kerkok poet. But what really tortures me is that you, born in Jerusalem itself, you bugger my boy, you Kerkok poet, my boy. And now you deny it. You swear to me by the temple of thundering Jove. Well, I don't believe you. Swear, O cut one, by someone, anti-Chalice. I don't know.
Yeah, we assume that that's the boy in question, who they're fighting over. So, well read, Zachary. Thank you. What do we learn from this? What can we infer from this source? So just a primary source without context about Judaism, Jewish practices, views on LGBT identity in the first century in Rome.
It feels very sort of Greek, if that makes sense. Like it sounds like it comes from like this kind of society when older men would have kind of like young lovers, if that makes sense.
Yes, well, like many things, Rome did kind of import a lot of Greek practice and culture as well as Greek mythology. Rome was very good at reappropriating other people's beliefs and practices and making them their own. And one of those was the practice that's often now called pederasty, of older men having sexual relations with younger men, and often in a very possessive way, in a kind of mentor relationship. That was the nature of the pederasty relationship, which is presumably what's implied here, as you say, in that Marshall is angry that someone who is clearly circumcised, we infer Jewish because what we know about the other person is that they're circumcised and born in Jerusalem, which is a pretty good guess that they're probably Jewish, has not only evidently, according to Marshall, stolen his work and plagiarized his poetry, but the real thing that he can't forgive is that he's stolen his lover. Which is just, I mean, the drama is just comes across the page, right? This is 2,000 years old, and it feels like an angry comment on Facebook, in different times, right? There's an element that just feels very relatable, perhaps, very real about this, and it tells us several interesting things about the Jewish community at the time. What is that? The person who's being described, who isn't named, the person who's being written to, is clearly a Jewish poet writing in Latin who is of a high enough caliber to be comparable to Martial, who was a very well established poet in the upper class Roman society at the time. So you have very well assimilated Jews. Despite being quite well assimilated, this clearly is someone who is still practicing Jewish practices, in that they're circumcised at least, and that they came from Jerusalem, probably before the siege. Remember, the temple was destroyed in 70. So this is probably someone who's lived through the destruction of Jerusalem and came to Rome. And we see obviously that although we can't make guesses about orientation necessarily, identity wise, we see that this clearly is a man who had sexual relationships with other men, because Marshall's angry that he stole his lover. And you can see the insult implied by Marshall in referring to him as a cut cock poet, which I realize is rather a harsh way of saying it, but as far as I know the Latin, that is in fact the way in which it's said in Latin, which is often very crude as a language. And what's amazing is that when Marshall is ridiculing this other man, he says that you swear to me by the temples of thundering Jove. Of course, Jove being the Roman version of Zeus. So our Jewish, circumcised, Jerusalem born, Latin speaking poet is evidently already sworn that he didn't steal Marshall's lover and swore by Zeus, but is now being asked to swear instead by this other person who we presume is the lover in question, but isn't clear at all. Absolutely complex, fascinating window into a very small interpersonal disagreement, but one that shows us that Jews who lived in the Roman Empire, who lived in Rome, were engaging in the same cultural practices, the same permissive attitude towards homosexuality that was very common in the ancient world, and and were no different than anyone else, subject to the same lovers' quarrels, conflicts over poetry being stolen, and evidently also referencing the same gods and the same religious practices. Anyone find that surprising?
But don't haven't Jews always sort of adopted some of the practices or beliefs, well, maybe not beliefs, of the countries and the places that they're living in? I mean,
Absolutely.
in the same way that, I don't know, there's lots of things that happen in British or American Jewry which are linked to, what has been a Christian country. I don't know whether you describe it as that anymore, but has been.
Absolutely. No, and that's probably mostly what's going on here is that, you know, Jews who lived in Rome were like Romans, just like, other people lived in Rome, acted like Romans. What's interesting about that is that it implies, of course, that homosexuality was not something that was seen as a deal breaker for Jewish identity, right? At this time, at least. Partaking in the very common Greco-Roman practice, especially of male-male sexual relationships, was not seen as something that was uh, a a threat to his Jewish identity. Maybe Marshall is trying to evoke his Jewishness as an insult, Maybe he's not. We don't really know too much of the context. We're guessing. But it's interesting to see that these two things went hand in hand in terms of his Jewishness, which is made very obvious by this, and also his very assimilated and very common practice of engaging in sexual relationships with other men. And it just isn't something that's even worth noting. What bothers Marshall is not that, but rather his attempted thievery of his poems and his lover. And it's interesting window into the fact that clearly, the objection, let's put it this way. Jews have always been very selective around which mitzvot in the Torah they enforce and don't enforce, depending on the time and place they live in. So at some certain times and places, Jews are very strict about enforcing the agricultural laws of the land of Israel, including how you can harvest fields and when and what type of produce. Other times, they completely ignore those laws. The same is true of the laws around sexual practices and sexual identity. Sometimes there's been a lot of enforcement, so to speak, or a lot of kind of restrictiveness around understanding those laws. Other times there's been a lot more relaxed attitude around them. And the nature of Judaism, a religion with 613 mitzvot, is that you can't be equally as passionate about all of them all the time. So it's really a value judgment about which ones matter to you. And every community and every Jewish person makes decisions around which ones matter to them. What we see here, I'm guessing, largely, is that at the time, any sense that there was a ban on homosexuality did not matter, and it didn't sacrifice Jewishness. So let's take a look at the next one. Now we're going to a Jewish source, and the rest are Jewish sources. This one is a piece from the Talmud. As usual, the Talmud quotes from the Mishnah and then adds later stratum of commentary. So the first part, quoting from the Mishnah, is from the 2nd century, and the latter part, commenting on that, is from probably the 4th or 5th century. And you see here a little window into how both anxiety around homosexuality and how rabbis interpreted certain texts as referential to homosexuality. Anyone like to read this for us? Come on then. All right, I'll read this one. But someone's got to read the next one. So the Mishnah it's a longer Mishnah, but there's a piece of it here. Young girls may go out on Shabbat wearing ribbons. This is the Mishnah about Shabbat. It has nothing to do with sexuality. The topic is Shabbat, and the ruling is young girls may go out on Shabbat wearing ribbons. Now, we might ask, why does that even need to be taught in the first place? It has to do with the question of whether the ribbons would fall or whether they might be tied in knots, and whether tying the knots would be a violation of Shabbat. It doesn't really concern us. But just to explain why it's there's a Mishnah that says young girls can go out on Shabbat wearing ribbons. Then there's an explanation from the Talmud that the father of Shmuel, which is a very early rabbi in the Talmudic period, didn't permit his daughters to go out wearing ribbons, and he didn't allow them to sleep together. There's a longer bit of it too, but it's not relevant. So we see a statement, an apocryphal statement, an anecdotal statement about Shmuel's father. This is 3rd century Babylonian Jewish community, prominent man, who evidently said the exact opposite of what the Mishnah says when it says they may go out on Shabbat wearing ribbons, and said that he didn't permit his daughters to go out wearing ribbons, and he also didn't allow them to sleep together. In analyzing a later stratum now, in analyzing that quote, he didn't permit them to sleep together, ask the question, could we say that this is actually supporting of the opinion of Rav Huna? What's the opinion of Rav Huna? The opinion of Rav Huna is, and then there's a quote from Rav Huna, women who rub with one another are unfit for marrying into the priesthood. So as usual in the Talmud, we have lots of different pieces of things which aren't necessarily all linked together, and they're trying to kind of understand a tradition. Now, Rav Huna's statement, if we go to the last part first, is obviously about women who engage in female-female sexual relationships. We can fairly well imply that, right? And his statement that this is clearly such a familiar and common practice that he had made a statement saying that they're unfit to marry into the priesthood. This means to marry a priest, a Kohen. And there's lots of restrictions on who the Kohanim can marry. They can't marry converts, they can't marry divorcees, etc. Evidently, they also can't marry women who have engaged in same-sex relationships. says Rav Huna. And the Talmud is asking, is this teaching about Shmuel's father, who wouldn't let his daughter sleep in the same bed, based on the same anxiety of Rav Huna's statement about women not being able to be married into the priesthood? Meaning, is this a more comprehensive issue where we're worried about women having same-sex relationships? Questions never answered, by the way, as usual, the Talmud. They get distracted and go on to something else. But it shows us the conversation that's taking place in the Talmud around an uncertainty. The question is an open question. Is there anxiety about women having same-sex relationships, or isn't there? Does it matter to us? Is it a violation of the Torah? Is it not a violation of the Torah? Notably, this is an open question because you could say the Torah is very clear about male-male same-sex relationships, which, by the way, it's not very clear, but it seems very clear because it says explicitly, a man shall not lay with a man, which we can talk more about, by the way. There's no biblical sources here today. But there's no statement about women. And so the rabbis are kind of investigating and discussing with each other what to make of women who engage in same-sex relationships, and they're obviously not sure. Rav Huna has a very restrictive point of view, but the others aren't sure about whether Shmuel's father made this rule for the same reason that Rav Huna did. And it leaves it kind of open-ended. It's just a small little glimpse into a conversation, but it shows us that rabbis were talking about this, talking about same-sex relationships, that they were unsure about whether or not it was something that was a problem or not, and that they had a distinction clearly between female-female same-sex relationships versus male-male same-sex relationships, which we'll see as well in the halachic sources. Any comments, questions on this before we go on to the halachic bit? Yeah.
Doesn't seem to make sense to me, because there's a big difference between 2 or 3 sisters sharing a bed and a female, same-sex relationship. I don't doesn't really, I can't see the link. And also the concern seems to be more for who Kohanim marry than the women having sex together.
Yes. And by the way, so the extension of this passage, kind of suggests that they go, oh no, this isn't the same thing. Rav Huna had a different concern. And the real thing that invalidates a woman from marrying into the priesthood is if she's seen to be, the word is often, zanut or zonah, which can mean kind of a harlot or prostitute, but can also mean promiscuous, right? Broadly, it means promiscuous. And that really seems to be the concern of Rav Huna here as well, is that there's an association between same-sex relationships and promiscuity, which continues, by the way, up until the Victorian period. I don't know if anyone's ever read Prouse In Search of Lost Time. I don't recommend it. It takes ages to read. Literally, I've been reading it for 2 years. I'm 77% of the way through. But a huge part of it is this very kind of 1890s anxiety about women in women-only spaces engaging in kind of casual same-sex relationships and how this is a sign of promiscuity. And the same thing seems to have been the case in the Talmudic period, because they're very anxious. Rav Huna is anxious not about necessarily same-sex relationships per se, but about this being an indication of promiscuous women and thus women unfit for the priesthood. So absolutely right, Debbie. I think they ultimately reject the idea that Shmuel's father was inspired by the same concern as Rav Huna, but they also never explained to us what Shmuel's father was worried about. So we don't know why he didn't let his daughters sleep together or go out wearing ribbons, even though the Mishnah says they can wear ribbons. The Talmud is a treacherous sea to swim in, and you often don't find any land. Zachary, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is this still held today? Like, would there be a problem in communities where if a woman wanted to marry a Cohen, but it was known that she'd had a girlfriend before she got engaged to, would that present a halakhic issue?
I mean, I think it would in Orthodox communities. And I think they would turn to a source like this and Rav Huna's statement and say precise. I mean, Rav Huna's statement is so straightforward, it seems, that they would go, yeah, no, that's a violation and you can't marry a Kohen. In reality, I don't know how much that would be disclosed or how that would be discussed. The nature of matchmaking services in the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox communities are often the case that they're very invasive in people's personal lives, and it would be very hard for someone to kind of have a an open fact of their having had previous same-sex relationships, any previous relationships, really. I mean, the shidduch system is broken for anyone, but you know, especially if there's any suspicion, which is basically what we feel here, right? Is that this is about suspicion. Okay, I want to look at a pretty long quote from the Mishneh Torah, which is the first code of Jewish law, meaning it attempts to codify what the Talmud says. Just to say, this is not something that I or anyone else hold to be completely valid or accountable to. This is very troubling stuff, a lot of this, because it's talking about punishments and about kind of sense of criminal liability. But I want us to look at it as a source, as part of the Jewish tradition, which it is, and also think about what is it that was going on that required such detail to be said in the source. That's always what's interesting from a historical point of view, right? Is that rabbis don't make a ruling about something unless it's something that happens. They don't make rulings about imaginary things. Usually, rabbis can be pretty ridiculous. So this is a section from the Mishneh Torah's codes around forbidden sexual intercourse. It's obviously quite explicit and difficult, so I'm going to read it lest I subject anyone else to that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the categories here. So when a man enters into relations with a male or has a male enter relations with him, once the corona is inserted into the anus, they should both be stoned if they are both adults. Again, we don't enforce this. Don't agree with this. As Leviticus 18:22 states, do not lie with a man, holding one liable for the act whether he is the active or passive partner. So Maimonides' concern is about who's responsible. His statement is both. If a minor of 9 years and a day or more is involved, the man who enters into relations or has the minor enter into relations with him should be stoned, and the minor is not liable. If a male minor was less than 9 years old, they're both free of liability. It is, however, appropriate for the court to subject the adult to stripes, that's lashes, for rebellious conduct for homosexual relations, although his companion was less than 9 years old. Again, completely different problems that we would raise today around consent, age, etc. One is liable for anal intercourse with an androgynous, just as one is liable for relations with another male. One who engages in vaginal intercourse with androgynous is not liable. There is doubt concerning the gender of a tumtum. Therefore, a person who has relations with a tumtum or vaginal intercourse with an androgynous should be given stripes for rebellious conduct. An androgynous may marry a woman. Like, seriously, huge amount to unpack here. And this is only a small section of the very long laws around forbidden sexual relationships, which, by the way, are very interesting as long as you can separate them from reality. And what do we see here in terms of what the concerns are from a logic point of view, right? Assuming that this is not how any of us think, what is Maimonides, who is the author of this text, thinking about? What is he worried about? What's motivating his statements around these laws?
So it seems to be that it's the penetration that's the problem, which is kind of interesting because we usually presume, maybe from like the cultures we grow up in, that it's kind of the non-reproductive part of the intercourse that presents like the theoretical problem. But here that doesn't really seem to be the concern, especially because like both parties would be punished under this system. Um, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, it's absolutely good observation. There's no statement here that this is about failing to procreate, which is something we hear sometimes cited. There's no statement about wasting seed, which is often one of the things that's evoked a kind of biblical sense that there's an anxiety around wasting seed, which is a whole different question. Instead, there's very different issues here around criminal liability. What else do we see? We have two categories in the second half, an androgynous and a tumtum. These are hard to map onto our contemporary understandings of different sexual presentations in humans, but probably both are what we would today call intersex of some variety. And one is usually understood to display aspects of both male and female genitalia, and the other is understood to display aspects of neither male nor female genitalia or ambiguous genitalia. So again, that both would be what we today call intersex largely. And you can see there's kind of distinctions made and about each of these as well in terms of trying to categorize and identify um, where these people fit into this system, because obviously it makes it a lot more complicated if someone is ambiguously sexed in terms of male and female binaries. Any thoughts on this very triggering source? Not something, by the way, again, that most would enforce, but it is. I mean, this is normative in terms of halacha. It would be foolish of me to say otherwise, right? Most rabbis would look at a source like this or similar sources in the Shulchan Aruch, a later Jewish code of law, and that's why they would say, oh, obviously, we can't permit LGBT relationships, weddings, etc. Is because look at this. But again, that's building on a cultural sensitivity, which is not necessarily a halachic one, right? If you think about where in this there's a biblical citation, where the mitzvah is, there's only one citation, which is that verse from Leviticus 18:22. Okay? And the worry about that, again, is about criminal liability and about this verse in particular. And part of what is evident from the context of that verse and from the context of the ancient Near East is that the understanding in the biblical period of homosexuality was that it's primarily an act of violence done during wartime, right? And it doesn't mean that we can just kind of ignore what the Torah says, but there's no doubt we see that in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. We see that in other stories of battle and warfare. That male rape, war rape, was a very common aspect of ancient warfare, and as a result, homosexual relations. Zachary made a very good distinction, right? A particular action is considered to be unacceptable because of its association with that. It's not making a statement here about a relationship or a feeling or a union or a lifestyle or anything like that. It's particularly about actions, which is expected from a halachic work that's focused on behavioral, codification.
And who would be responsible for deciding someone was an androgynous or a tumtum? Is that the rabbis decide? Who decides that?
Well, it's never really clear, exactly. I think it's usually self-identification, in these cases. There's not, so that these are categories that appear often in halakhic literature, the androgynous and the tumtum. Obviously, androgynous is a Greek word, and it's not clear how frequent it was or how much they understood it to be a common thing, but it must have been common enough for them to talk about it, right? There's many places in the Mishnah, the first kind of work of Jewish law, where they make exceptions. They say, oh, well, this is the rule, but if you're an androgynous, then you do this. So they must have had a pretty familiar sense that this was a fairly common thing. Intersex people are a significant minority, 1, 2, 3%, depending how you count. So it's enough for people to comment on it, but it's not clear exactly who determines these things and what the process would have been like for establishing it. I think largely it was just kind of a community norm or self-identification or family. Family played a big role in people's marital prospects, and presumably that was an element of it. Note, by the way, that the androgynous is treated as a woman in one regard, meaning vaginal intercourse is okay, whereas anal intercourse is not. So it's kind of treated both as male and female, but is also not permitted to marry a woman. So not clear exactly what that means for marriage prospects of the androgynous. Um, the assumption must be that androgynous must be treated as a woman and thus can only marry a man, and is treated in largely it's just kind of assimilated into femaleness, even though that's not the reality. The tumtum, who is usually understood to be of ambiguous genitalia, is basically just prevented from having any relationships. Right? Any relations with the tumtum seem to be in violation, although it's not spelled out explicitly here. So obviously not a life that we'd wish on anyone, um, and shows a great deal of confusion around what these categories are and what they mean in terms of our own contemporary understanding. Also note that the concern here is criminal, not social. Maimonides is interested in who is the criminal, who is liable, who receives lashes, when do they receive punishments, under what conditions, etc. So this is a criminal code. Right, it says an androgynous may marry a woman. which I guess means they're treated as a man in that regard, or they're just allowing. But yes, I guess so. So then yeah, it's there's a whole lot of literature on these two categories. It's a very interesting question for how do we understand them in our own life. From what I've understood from people who know more about this than I do, is that largely these don't map onto our own sense of any particular category precisely, but they kind of overlap in interesting ways. Um, these couple sources we've looked at are largely social, the martial one, and halachic in terms of Talmudic debate and the halachic code in the Mishneh Torah. And what I want to look at now, this source here, is a Kabbalistic source. This is a mystical point of view. This is from a 16th century work. By the way, we're going in sequence. Historically, we're getting closer and closer to the present day. This is from a 16th century work called Shahar Gilgulim, which means the Gate of Reincarnations, which is discussing the Jewish view on reincarnation, Gilgulei Neshamot. Part of what comes into that is understanding of souls being gendered and the implications of that. Someone want to read this paragraph for us here?
I'll do it. Know that sometimes a man may reincarnate in the body of a woman because of a transgression, such as homosexual activity or something similar. This woman, who has received the soul of a man, will not be able to conceive and become pregnant. This woman will need great merit to enable her to become pregnant and give birth. Seems contradictory, but the only way it can be done is that some other feminine soul must enter her as a ibur.
Yeah. So ibor literally means pregnancy. And the idea of ibor is that people can, it's basically positive possession. That during your life you can be possessed by the soul of other people who have died in a positive way, not in like an exorcist head turning, spinning around the ceiling way, but in a positive, help you on your journey through life way. So that's the notion of ibor. So you can kind of have a voluntary possession by the soul of someone who's deceased. So what's being described here in terms of reincarnation? I think it goes without saying, by the way, this is conjecture. This isn't based on evidence.
So if you showed that you might be interested in men sexually during your life, you can then sort of come back being a woman, because that's what it must mean if you were interested in men sexually. I don't know, that's...
Yes,
But
no, it's interesting. You're seeing it as a neutral or positive thing, whereas he's understanding it probably as a punishment, thanks to patriarchy.
Well, no, well, I'm not sure I am seeing it as positive. It's, I don't think at all. It's sort of just assuming that if you're interested in men sexually, then you must be more like a woman, which, yeah, I don't think is a, I think that's quite a, I don't know. I suppose may have been the views at the time, perhaps, or whatever. But obviously, it's not what we would say now.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was a common idea of kind of feminizing, feminizing gay men and understanding that somehow they were women trapped in men's bodies. Here we have kind of the reverse in some way, which is the same idea, which is that someone who is in their lifetime engaging in male homosexual activity ends up being reincarnated in a woman's body, but is still a male soul, which is obviously a mismatch. And the mismatch leads to infertility, is the understanding here. So this is an explanation of infertility to some extent, which is obviously extremely problematic as well from a variety of other points of view. That if a woman is infertile, it may be because her soul is actually the soul of a man and not the soul of a woman. And the only way that she can still become pregnant, even though she's infertile, is with a female soul entering her body as a kind of positive possession in this practice of Ibor. So she'd have to add to her male soul a female soul, and thus she could kind of reach a point in which she could become pregnant.
And that's supposed to happen if she's of great merit. That's like right. if you're of great merit, then you can have this.
Yes.
That's your reward.
Well, the merit is if she can only have the other soul join her as a reward. The being possessed by the soul of someone else is the reward, which doesn't sound that great. But it also there's a sense here that in her action, in the reincarnation, there's a redemption, right? Again, this goes back to what Zachary raised earlier, this idea that one of the problems with homosexuality is an avoidance of procreation, right? That you're actively avoiding the mitzvah of pru, be fruitful and multiply. And so there's a sense here that to redeem the soul of the man who's reincarnated in her body, she needs to kind of overcome that in order to become pregnant and thus kind of heal the rift that was caused by it. It's all very strange, perhaps, in terms of our understanding of both reincarnation and sexuality. Anyone see anything else in here about this idea of reincarnation, how that helps them to understand in the 16th century in a mystical way, both human sexual behavior and this idea of rebirth?
What I would say is it's interesting in is it an explanation for a woman a woman not being able to give birth, and then one, if it is, which one is thinking it is, then how do we explain some of the imahot, Hannah, Sarah, who were all akarot, who were unable to conceive? Are we telling them they were possessed?
Well, it would imply, David, you're absolutely right, it would imply that all of the famous Akarot, barren women, actually had male souls, which is, a weird kind of way of reinforcing patriarchy, because a lot of the barren women are, of course, the heroic women, and of course they would be heroic women because they have males. There's a weird kind of both negative, as typical of many patriarchies, there's a negation of masculinity when it comes to homoeroticism, and a reaffirmation of masculinity through women who have male souls and thus are more holy and more significant and whatever else, which is not unusual, but very problematic for lots of reasons. But yes, that would be one implication. Although it's not clear, I don't think, from the text, I have to look at the context, that it's always the case that every barren woman has a male soul. I think they would explain there's other reasons as well.
The other thing I would say, I mean, of course they would. The other thing I would say is you've just been talking about homosexuals as far as women are concerned as well in previous. So that would that say then, could we say that men who are infertile or have women's bodies inside them, souls, the women's souls inside them?
Absolutely. I mean, they don't say that here, but absolutely, I think is something that's implied and is, I think, stated elsewhere, that basically souls and bodies can be mismatched, and when they are, the things don't work quite right. I think, by the way, they also would explain sometimes that the kind of a desire for the same sex is a result of having the wrong soul in the wrong body in the first place. Because obviously these cycles of reincarnation go around and around and around. But if that's the case, then you're kind of trapped, right? You're trapped in this endless cycle, because if you're reincarnated in the wrong body because you engage homosexual relations, but then you engage in homosexual relations because you reincarnated the wrong body, then you end up kind of stuck. Which is why partially they have this idea of ibur, of additional souls. You can add something else to the system to try and change it. But it's a very kind of mechanistic understanding of reincarnation, which is difficult, right? This is by the way, this is in the context of a long passage that describes all the things you might be reincarnated as for different crimes. So, for instance, if you murder someone, you get reincarnated as water. One of the things that's stated is if you fail to observe the commandment of procreation, whether for this reason or others, then you get reincarnated as a rabbit. Very good poetic punishment. If you fail to procreate, then you end up coming back as a rabbit and doomed to procreate forever. And there's a sense here of kind of poetic justice in this reincarnation system, not too different from what we might call karma, but obviously there's a value underlying a lot of these statements around who gets reincarnated as what.
And am I not mistaken that even in today, in some some Orthodox rabbis, if that may be a term, give the excuse of homosexuality today as, you know, they forgive it almost, but because they say, well, it's not really that person, it's
They've got the
someone
wrong
else in that,
soul.
they've got the wrong soul. Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely. There's a weird kind of apologism that you see very often in Kabbalistic influenced ultra-Orthodox communities, where rabbis will cite sources like this to explain, oh, well, it's not so strange because, of course, they've got the wrong soul. Which is, I don't know, they're probably trying to be helpful. Pastorally, it's better than hunting people down and stoning them. But obviously, it's still, if those are our options. But it's obviously a long way from affirming a positive view of same-sex relationships. Yeah, Zachary.
I know that we're not supposed to be using this as a basis for like kind of how to actually understand or view the world, but I would really love to know how Kabbalah slash this kind of like Jewish viewpoint would explain like a transgender person who is also attracted to the same sex. Because it seems here there's a lot of confusion of like being gay and being transgender is kind of like the same thing, kind of.
Yep.
I guess maybe one's just a little bit more kind of an extreme version of the same behavior. I'd love to know how they would kind of like how Kabbalah would handle that.
So it's a good segue onto our next source, our last one, because it does kind of, you see a development in the understanding, but you've stated it very well actually, that in this source, in this point of view, there's a spectrum basically of extremity, and the understanding what we might think they would think of transgender as just an extreme form of this problem that creates what we understand as homosexuality. But obviously, we now see that differently, and we divide those two things: sexual orientation versus sexual attraction versus identity versus whatever. We have a much more nuanced sense of it than they did. Largely, they're looking at queerness broadly and trying to explain it, and they're not really too concerned with the intricacies that we would now identify. But, right, this is 1540s or whatever. Not too long after that, you do see a development of more complex understandings of gender identity and sexual identity. And there's an absolutely amazing source, which I want to look at with our last 15 minutes, which is a tshuva. So the primary literature of halakha is not the code of Maimonides we saw above, but actually a genre of literature called Sheilot Utshuvot, questions and answers, in which people send rabbis questions, and rabbis write an answer, and the question and the answer get published, and many of them get published in a book, and sometimes they get syndicated and sent around. It's still a way in which halachic literature is written. You can buy Shut, Sheilot, Utshuvot from modern rabbis. Although not too many people ask me halachic questions, I can make up some and pretend and write some answers and then publish it as a book if I wanted, which I won't do. But this source, right, is from a modern Sephardi rabbi named Yosef Palashe, who is someone writes him with a question and he writes a response. So let's look at the question. I'm going to read the question and then we'll look at his response. The question is a proper get, a get is a Jewish divorce document, needed in the following circumstance? A certain man married a young Jewish woman and was with her in the manner of men and women. That means sex, by the way. We love our euphemisms. But after some many years, an event occurred to her, and she was changed from female to male in every respect. What is the law in this case for one who had been a woman and married to a man and then became a man? If he wishes to marry another woman, does this husband need to give a proper get to divorce her according to the laws of Moshe and Israel? Or rather, does he not need to give a get for now, or at all, since she is not a woman any longer, but a man? Do not be surprised by this question, since all things are possible, and there is nothing new under the sun, as you can see in the book Yad Ne'eman, where he brought several examples like this, and additionally wrote that one young woman was transformed into a man at the very hour they were leading her unto the wedding canopy. So I can see Zachary laughing, right? Very excited about this. It's just the casualness of him asking this question. Remember, this is 1890s, the 1880s, 1890s. So not super long time ago, but definitely in an era in which homosexuality is viewed very differently. The same era as Proust, who I referenced earlier, right? Whose book is largely just a kind of anxiety about homosexuality. And here we're talking about what we would now call transgender identity, right? Largely. in which he asked a question about a case in which a man and a woman are married, and then the woman becomes a man. Does the original man need to provide his now ex-husband a get? Because obviously a get would normally be issued to an ex-wife in order to provide divorce, but there's no provision for husband to husband get. And notably, the questioner, who isn't named, says, don't be too surprised by this because there's a whole book that involves a bunch of these things. So that book, the Yad Ne'eman, is a halachic book. It's another collection of Sheilot Utshuvot, questions and answers. And that was written even earlier. So that was written in kind of the 1840s by a Sephardi rabbi in Salonika in what's now Greece, was then the Ottoman Empire. So this clearly was a common question, a common enough question. And I love that he references that in the Yad Ne'eman, someone had asked the question about a woman who was transformed into a man at the moment they're walking her down the aisle to the chuppah. Can you just imagine? Like, there's just a magic transformation at that moment. What do we do?
I've got visions of the film Yentl.
I'm not familiar with the film. Is there a similar scene?
Nearly. If there was a Yentl 2, there probably would be. It's a Barbara Streisand film where she's a young girl who wants to study in a yeshiva. So she dresses up as a yeshiva boy. She's really young at the time, and she dresses up as a boy and studies in yeshiva. And she gets really close with this other male who they get really friendly as two guys, swimming. They go to this lake together to swim, and
it's like Achilles and Patroclus. I'm sure they were just friends. Yeah.
And then but the original story by us, exactly. Yes, is much better.
Okay.
Okay.
So other people
have seen it, so you better see it. To catch
up.
up.
I'll have to see it. Sounds like a great queer Jewish movie, right? For a lot of reasons. But there's a distinction to be made here, which is really interesting, between cross-dressing versus a transformation in identity. And what's amazing is that actually the rabbis, both the questioner and the answer, are not talking about, it seems, cross-dressing, what we would call cross-dressing, or kind of a gender performance, but actually a biological transformation, right? A non-surgical, we assume, biological transformation, a magical one, perhaps. So let's look at the answer. Okay, response. Here's the answer. Regarding the case discussed by the author of Yad Ne'eman, again, that's Chaim Avraham Miranda, who was in Salonika, died in 1802, so it's a much earlier work. He wrote that a holy one from among the sages of Jerusalem was wondering whether this woman was obligated in circumcision or exempt. Another great question, right? But it's obvious that she is exempt, since Scripture says every male's foreskin, meaning one whose essence was male is obligated in circumcision, but not for one who is female in essence, but was made male, right? So this is a question that's raised around gender confirmation surgery today, in terms of, or bottom surgery or other surgeries, in terms of whether or not circumcision is required in transitioning from female to male. It seems that they decided, according to this rabbi in this 18th century, that it wasn't. Whereas obviously the reverse would be true. And this is still, by the way, largely the norm today halachically, is that male to female transition, circumcision is required as long as there is any vestige of a penis, and circumcision is not strictly required in the reverse, in female to male transition, which is what they're talking about here, although they don't label it that way. But that's really a side note. He's explaining, oh, well, that source you referenced about the wedding canopy, that was actually a question about circumcision. Now back to our question. Regarding our question, it seems that a get is not needed, since he is a man now and not a woman. For the format of the get is that a man gives it to his wife and writes, "You are my wife." But in this case, there's no wife, but a man. And regarding this event, that an adult woman should be transformed into a man, how could it happen in a natural way, that this inverted world could be grasped by human intellect? Do not be surprised by this, for this was already explained in the book Yad Ne'eman, which wrote, quote, "You should know that scholars of anatomy have not found any difference between the forms of the organs of males and those of females, except that hers are internal and his are external, meaning the genitals. For a woman has within her a member, that's a penis, and testicles, as is known. And in a case where there is an excess heat and additional blood, perhaps the female genitals expand, and thus the internal member can be turned out, and from female they will be turned male. And in reverse, if there's insufficient blood and excess cold, the male genitals could shrink and return into the body, and thus from the male form they would become female, etc. So, just gotta say, maybe it's bad science, but for 1750 or whatever, when this was written, this is a pretty impressively accurate understanding of anatomy, right? Which is that ultimately male and female genitalia are largely the same thing in different places, right? That element, they have it right. Obviously, they're not right about the idea that a certain amount of blood or heat can switch it like magic. It takes a lot more than that. But it's a really interesting kind of casual and scientific understanding of the question being quoted from this rabbi from Salonika. And so it seems logical that since this woman has many visible signs that he is a man, they mix up the pronouns, we have to forgive them that, as can be seen by everyone, he does not need a get, since he is not a woman, but a full man, even as we have said, for this man who was a woman first and then changed into a man. Right, so that's the ruling on the question. The question was, does the man need to give his now ex-husband, formerly ex-wife, a get? And this rabbi, Yosef Palashe's answer is no, because he's no longer a woman, he's a man, and a man doesn't get a get. Thus it seems to me that when this man says the morning blessings, he should not say, Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not made me a woman, since he had been made a woman at first, in his mother's womb, and was brought into the world in the form of a woman. He should say instead, Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has transformed me into a man. Right. Amazing. Anyone who's spent any time thinking about these questions will know how amazing this source is, because that's not a blessing. He made up this blessing, and it is the most modern sounding, gender affirming blessing that we could possibly imagine. Shehafchani leish, right? Who has transformed me into a man. So not only does Hacham Yosef Palashe from Izmir in Turkey in 1896, when this is published, presumably he wrote it earlier during his lifetime, not only does he rule in a way that we would see as very modern regarding the question of the get, he also goes beyond that to construct an idea of actually how this person can engage with Jewish practice. So there's lots of things here that feel very modern, and it is somewhat modern. But just to look back, right, from this source, which is fabulously interesting, to the Kabbalistic understanding of trying to explain what we would understand as infertility and homosexuality and homoeroticism, to the very restrictive and criminal-focused halachic code of the 11th century written by Maimonides, to the Talmudic confusion about how or whether we should be anxious around women's same-sex relationships, to even before the Mishnah was ever written, Roman poets talking smack about Jews who were engaged in relationships with, they thought, their lovers, and the debate around that. We see actually, correctly to Noam's title of his book, A Rainbow Thread, that the idea that in the 21st century, when we consider the role of LGBT individuals, queer individuals in the Jewish community, we're coming up with new things is nonsense, right? Although the sources haven't always been positive, and although a lot of the sources are things we wouldn't necessarily endorse, there is no doubt that there has been a long and quite detailed and quite complex series of sources and conversations that engage with real questions around diverse and queer Jewish identities. And that's really important, because not everyone's going to agree, and certainly many Jewish communities today have very different views than our own regarding these questions. But what's really important is that Judaism is a religion of sources. You have to show your work. If you want to say that Judaism can be LGBT plus affirming, which I think it can, then you've got to show that that's in our tradition, in our sources. Even if there's sources that disagree, you can find the sources that do agree, and you can work with those and develop those and expand those. And that's what we've tried to do in the Masorti movement. For instance, in constructing the same-sex marriage ceremony that we use in the Masorti movement called shutafut, right? We've actually based that on lots of precedent in the halachic literature around how you would put together a ceremony to engineer a marriage that is different than the heteronormative kiddushin marriage ceremony. And that's really important to us. We don't just make up new things. We don't just look at it and go, well, we'd like it to be this, let's have it be that. We look at the tradition and at the sources and try and engage with it and try and bring something out of it that is reflective of that long conversation that's happened across the ages. And a lot of it we don't want to use, some of it we might want to use, and some of it actually, like that last source, I think from Hacham Palashe, is actually better than anything we could imagine what might be written today. And it's important for us to be willing to engage with those sources, which is why the work that Noam did in putting this together is absolutely critical, because it exposes the fact, as he says, right, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the first century to 1969, that there is queer Judaism has always been queer Jews and will always be an aspect of Judaism which engages with these questions, and that continues and has been continuous since the beginning. And although we don't know much else, I think that's the most important thing to take away from looking at some of these sources, is that there's always been that, and there probably always will be, and it's something that we have to work with. Any final thoughts, comments, questions, curiosities, movie recommendations?
Actually, I'd love to jump in there and say that I have quite strong feelings about the film Yentl, but I cannot recommend highly enough the original Yiddish short story, which actually plays with the concept of gender a lot more in terms of like pronoun uses and stuff. So it's really worth checking out the original short story of Yentl. It's very short, and that's also like it's also like old, like, and it plays with gender of this person who's kind of like born with the soul of a man in like a woman's world, and it's like old. So, and it's nice for us to see. I think something that's amazing about these sources is to see that it's existed forever. Yeah.
Really good.
Also, I'm stealing that blessing. It's incredible.
Isn't it great? Yeah, I love that. Any other thoughts, comments? Realized we did a whirlwind tour of quite a few sources of different backgrounds and eras, literally from the first century to the 19th. But there's a lot more where that came from. And if it's something that interests you, really definitely encourage Noam's book and lots of other great resources. Keshet in the UK does amazing work in helping to put together sources and resources on queer Judaism. And as a community at SAMS, we're always looking to improve how we can serve and reflect the diverse makeup of our members better. So it's really a good exercise to do, is to think about how these sources reflect our tradition. Well, I'm very grateful that you guys joined me this evening, mostly quite quietly, but that's okay. And I'm pleased that we had a chance to look at this together. Thank you for joining us. Any questions or any thoughts, or if you want to find out more or see any of these more in depth, just shoot me a message because it's really quite an important thing. And I hope you all have a good evening.